The sun hung low over the small southern town of Havenwood, casting warm hues across its cobblestone streets. The market square buzzed with activity, vendors shouting about fresh produce, children weaving between stalls, and housewives gossiping as they examined bolts of fabric. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Among the chaos, there stood a small, humble grocery store. Its sign, faded and chipped, read Elijah's Goods. Elijah, the young black shopkeeper, swept the front stoop of his store. His lean figure and weary eyes betrayed his daily struggle. Townsfolk passed by, some glancing at him with disdain, others ignoring him entirely. Across the square, Margaret Fletcher, a middle-aged widow dressed in a modest cream dress, stopped to watch. A group of white men loitered near Elijah's shop, muttering and sneering. "Don't think you'll make it here much longer," one of them jeered loudly, tossing an apple core toward Elijah. Margaret's heart tightened, but she stayed rooted to her spot. She gripped her handbag, torn between stepping forward and walking away. As the laughter of the men rang out, she turned and walked briskly home, her face flushed with shame. Inside the shop, Elijah leaned against the counter, staring at his nearly empty shelves. The faint smell of dried beans and old wood filled the air. His sister, Mary, sat on a stool near the cash register, her arms crossed. "Elijah, we can't keep doing this," Mary said. Her voice was steady, but the worry was clear in her tone. "We barely have enough money to pay the supplier, and now folks are too scared to even walk in here." "I'm not leaving, Mary," Elijah said firmly. "This is our store. Our father built it with his own hands, and I won't let them scare us out." Mary sighed, standing to face him. "You're brave, but bravery doesn't pay the bills. Think about it." The bell over the door jingled, but it was only the wind. No customers had come that day. Margaret sat alone in her parlor, the evening light spilling through lace curtains. Her home was modest but well kept, filled with mementos from her late husband, Thomas. On the coffee table lay his journals, neatly stacked and bound in worn leather. Margaret opened one and traced the words with her finger. "Justice is a calling for the brave," Thomas had written. "We cannot stand silent when others are denied their God-given rights." Margaret sighed and closed the journal, the words echoing in her mind. Her maid, Gladys, walked in carrying a tray of tea. Gladys, a black woman with kind eyes and a knowing smile, placed the tray down carefully. "Miss Margaret, you hear about that trouble at Elijah's store?" Gladys asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Margaret nodded. "Yes, I saw it," Margaret admitted, her voice faltering. "It's disgraceful." "Disgraceful, yes. But it'll keep happening unless someone stands up for that boy," Gladys said, pouring the tea. Her words hung in the air as Margaret sipped her tea in silence. Sunday service at the town's white church ended with the usual hum of conversations, as women lingered in their wide-brimmed hats and men shook hands. Margaret stood at the edge of a group of women, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. "Did you hear about that Elijah boy?" one woman sneered. "He's still trying to run that little shop of his. It's a wonder he hasn't packed up and left yet." "I wouldn't set foot in that place," another added. "Imagine the nerve of him thinking he belongs in our market." Margaret bit her tongue. Her lips tightened, and she looked down at her polished shoes. She felt the urge to speak, but she knew it would make her an instant pariah. Instead, she excused herself, mumbling about needing to tend to her garden. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas. She remembered a time when they had debated abolitionist literature together, long before the town became as rigid as it was now. In her mind, she saw Thomas standing at the fireplace, his eyes bright with conviction. "We have to be the ones to lead, Margaret. If good people do nothing, then the wicked will always win." The memory made her chest ache. Thomas had always been the brave one. She had admired his strength, but never thought she could match it. Margaret strolled through the market in the fading light, her footsteps echoing in the near-empty square. As she passed Elijah's shop, she saw him sweeping the front stoop again. His movements were slower now, tired, but determined. A single lantern glowed inside the shop, casting a warm light on the worn shelves. She paused, her hand hovering over the clasp of her handbag. Before she could move, Elijah looked up and met her gaze. There was no anger, no pleading, just a quiet resilience that made Margaret's chest tighten. She nodded slightly and walked on, the weight of her inaction heavy on her shoulders. That night, Margaret sat at her desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Her pen hovered over the page as she debated her next move. The town supplier, an old friend of hers, had the power to make a difference for Elijah's shop. If she reached out to him, perhaps she could help. Justice is a calling for the brave. Thomas's words echoed in her mind again. With a deep breath, she began to write. The following morning, Margaret sealed the letter and slipped it into her purse. She walked to the post office, feeling the weight of the choice she had made. She handed the letter to the clerk and turned to leave, her heart racing. As she walked back home, the whispers of the townsfolk seemed louder than ever. Margaret knew she had taken a step she couldn't undo. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, she felt a spark of purpose. The next morning, Margaret walked into Elijah's store for the first time. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Its sound a stark contrast to the bustling noise outside. The air was filled with the scent of aged wood, fresh bread, and a faint trace of spice. Elijah, who had been behind the counter organizing dried beans, looked up with mild surprise. He didn't expect any visitors, let alone a white woman. Margaret's heart beat faster as she crossed the threshold, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, even though no one else was present. Elijah set down the bag of flour he was holding and gave her a polite nod. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but cautious. Margaret smiled nervously, clearing her throat. "Good morning. I've come to. I need some eggs," she said, her voice almost too soft, as if she were afraid of being overheard. She approached the small counter where eggs were stacked in a wooden crate. Her hand hovered uncertainly over the carton, feeling the tension in the air. Elijah watched her quietly, waiting for her to make the first move. He'd dealt with the suspicious stares and cruel words from white customers for so long. He no longer expected kindness. "I don't mean to intrude," Margaret said after a long pause. "I've heard you've been having trouble with supplies, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do." Her words were hesitant, but they hung in the air, a subtle challenge to the unwritten rules of the town. Elijah's eyes widened for a moment, unsure whether to take her seriously. No one in town had shown him this sort of consideration, at least not openly. He kept his composure, but felt a flicker of hope stir in him. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I don't think there's much anyone can do," he replied softly, his tone laced with a mix of pride and resignation. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She bought the eggs, paid, and walked out of the store with a promise she hadn't yet voiced. She would return. That afternoon, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, anxiously awaiting a letter from her friend, Edward Grant. He owned a large supply chain for local grocers, and her late husband had worked with him for years. Margaret had written to him, asking for help, but she wasn't sure how he would respond, given the sensitive nature of her request. The postman knocked, handing her a small envelope. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she opened it, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "Dear Margaret, it's been a long while since we last spoke. I'm sorry to hear about Elijah's troubles. I'd be more than happy to help him with the shipment. I'll send a truck with fresh stock next week, at a reasonable rate. You were always a voice of reason in the past. I trust you know what you're doing. Sincerely, Edward Grant *. Margaret folded the letter slowly, a small sigh escaping her lips. This was the first concrete step toward helping Elijah, but she knew it was only the beginning. Her heart swelled with a mix of excitement and dread. She had no idea what this small act of kindness might set in motion. The days that followed were quiet in the market square, but something was changing. Elijah's shelves began to fill. Canned goods, fresh vegetables, and bags of flour. By some unseen hand, the stock seemed to improve overnight, and word spread quickly among the town's gossiping class. One morning, as Margaret passed the market, she overheard a conversation between two women standing outside the butcher's shop. "Have you seen Elijah's store lately?" one of them asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "It's suddenly full of everything, like magic. You think he's getting some sort of help? That's mighty strange, isn't it?" "I don't know," the other replied, her tone uncertain, "but I wouldn't go in there. Not after all that's happened." Margaret kept walking, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of their words, the curiosity, the suspicion building. She had hoped her help would go unnoticed, but now it seemed it would only attract more trouble. The next morning, Margaret returned to Elijah's store. She wasn't sure what had made her come back so soon. Perhaps it was a sense of guilt for the quiet way she tried to help, or perhaps it was the hope that Elijah would know how much she cared. As she entered, Elijah looked up from behind the counter. He was adjusting a display of canned tomatoes, his movements deliberate and methodical. When he saw her, he smiled, an unexpected, genuine smile. "Ma'am," he greeted her, his voice softer than before. "I see you've been coming by often." Margaret nodded, stepping forward. "I wanted to check in. I hope the new supplies are helpful." Elijah's eyes glimmered with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "They're more than helpful. They're a blessing. I don't know how to thank you enough, but I must say, this isn't something I expected from anyone around here." Margaret glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "You don't need to thank me," she said, her voice low, "but I hope it can help bring more people in. This town can be difficult to change, but if you stay strong, Elijah, you'll make it." His eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension between them disappeared. "Thank you, Miss Fletcher," he said, a hint of emotion in his voice. "I'll keep fighting." That evening, as Margaret attended a tea party at the home of her longtime friend, Charlotte Mayfield, the tension in the air was palpable. The women sipped tea and exchanged pleasantries, but it was clear that something had changed in their dynamic. "Margaret dear, we heard you've been shopping at Elijah's," Charlotte said, her tone sweet but laced with an edge. "How is the grocery store doing these days?" Margaret felt a flush creeping up her neck. "It's doing fine," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I don't see any harm in supporting local businesses. But Elijah's store is not just any business, is it?" Another woman interjected. "We all know the kind of people he serves." Margaret's heart raced. She had been in this circle for years, but now the judgments felt sharper, more pointed. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, each one silently accusing her of an unspoken betrayal. "I think," Margaret said, her voice shaking with quiet resolve, "it's time for a change around here." The room fell silent. Margaret stood up abruptly, excusing herself, and left the gathering before anyone could respond. She walked home in a daze, the sting of isolation settling into her chest. She was becoming a stranger in her own town. The next day, Elijah discovered a note pinned to the door of his shop. The writing was crude, hastily scrawled in thick, black ink. "Get out of here while you still can, or things will get worse. You don't belong." Elijah stood frozen for a moment, staring at the note, his fists clenched. He felt the anger rising in him, but it was tempered with a quiet fear. He knew the stakes were high. Later that afternoon, Margaret visited Elijah to check on him, unaware of the note. As she entered the shop, Elijah's face was tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something sharper. "Someone left me a message," Elijah said quietly, holding out the note. Margaret's face paled as she read the words. The threats were now real. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this for you." Elijah shook his head. "It's not your fault, Miss Fletcher, but I won't back down." Margaret nodded, but her stomach twisted with dread. The town's hostility was growing, and with it, the danger for Elijah and herself. Despite the threats, Margaret continued visiting Elijah's shop. Their conversations, initially polite and formal, grew more personal as they shared small moments of camaraderie. Elijah talking about his dreams for the store, Margaret reflecting on the loss of her husband, and both of them sharing a quiet understanding of how difficult it was to fight the injustices surrounding them. One evening, as she helped Elijah reorganize some shelves, Margaret found herself laughing at a joke he made about his suppliers. For the first time in months, she felt the sense of hope stir inside her. By the end of the week, There was a noticeable change in Elijah's business. A few black families, who had been too afraid to shop there before, began entering the store. They didn't speak openly about the risks they were taking, but their presence spoke volumes. Elijah's eyes glinted with cautious optimism. Margaret walked by the shop that evening, and as she glanced inside, she saw the small signs of change. A few more customers, a few more smiles. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she continued down the street, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet pride. Despite the threats, despite the danger, Elijah was still standing, and so was she. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had taken the first step towards something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt the stirrings of courage in her heart. It was late afternoon when Elijah stood outside his store, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The sun hung low, casting a golden light over the square. As he turned back to his shop, a group of white men approached, their loud voices echoing across the empty market. "Is this your place now, Elijah?" One of them sneered, his tone thick with disdain. Elijah stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides. He had seen these men before, heard their insults, and felt their eyes on him. But today, something about their presence felt different, more dangerous. "You've been getting too big for your britches," another man taunted, taking a step forward. "Not welcome here, boy." Elijah forced himself to remain calm, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just trying to run a business. I'm not bothering anyone." The men laughed, but there was a cold edge to their amusement. One of them stepped closer, almost nose to nose with Elijah. "You better watch yourself. We don't take kindly to your kind stepping above your place." Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Margaret appeared from the corner of the square. She had been watching from a distance, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed forward, her voice shaking but firm. "Leave him alone," Margaret shouted, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You have no right to treat him like this. This is his store." The men turned toward her, their faces twisted in disbelief. They took a step back, but one of them spat on the ground in front of her. "Stay out of this, Miss Fletcher," he growled. "This is none of your business." Margaret stood her ground, meeting his gaze with a quiet, resolute strength. "I will not stand by while you intimidate him. I will stand by him." The men exchanged a glance, grumbling under their breath before they turned and walked away, muttering insults as they retreated. Elijah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. "You didn't have to do that." Margaret shook her head, her voice soft but strong. "It's the right thing to do. No one deserves to be treated that way." Margaret hadn't been back to her usual social gatherings in weeks, but today, Charlotte Mayfield and a few of the other women had invited her for tea at Charlotte's house. Margaret was hesitant, but she couldn't keep avoiding them forever. As she entered Charlotte's home, the familiar faces greeted her with forced smiles. The room was filled with the clink of teacups and the soft murmur of conversation. But it was clear that the topic on everyone's mind was the same: Elijah's store. "Margaret darling," Charlotte began, her voice dripping with sweetness, "we've been hearing rumors about you and that shopkeeper of yours." Margaret froze, her hand tightening around her teacup. "What rumors?" "Oh, you know," Charlotte continued, her eyes narrowing slightly, "about you buying goods from him, helping him, supporting his business." Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "People are talking, Margaret. You've always been such a good, respectable woman. What could you be thinking?" One of the other women chimed in, her voice laced with judgment. "It's not just the store, Margaret. It's everything. You've been seen walking around with him, talking to him. Are you trying to destroy your good name?" Margaret set her teacup down with a soft clink. Her hands were steady, though her heart raced. She met their eyes one by one, refusing to back down. "I'm helping a man who needs it," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I'm not going to sit by while he's treated like this. If that makes me a bad person in your eyes, then so be it." The room fell silent. The women exchanged uncomfortable glances, But Margaret refused to let their disapproval sway her. "I won't apologize for doing what's right," she added firmly. Charlotte's smile faltered as she leaned back in her chair. "Very well, Margaret, but don't say we didn't warn you." Margaret didn't respond. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, and left the room without another word. The next week, Elijah found himself staring at a modest stack of goods, bags of flour, cans of beans, and a few other necessities. Business had picked up slightly, but the threat of violence was ever present. He was grateful for the support from the Black community, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed people to see his shop as a legitimate place of business, not just a token of defiance. As he arranged the goods, Mary walked in, a hopeful look on her face. "Elijah, I've been talking to a few people. Word's spreading about your shop. More and more are coming by to buy. Not just us either. Some of the townfolk too." Elijah's eyes lit up at the news. "Really?" "Yes," Mary said with a nod. "It's slow, but it's happening. I heard from Mrs. Thompson. She said she saw a few white families stop by this week. They didn't stay long, but it's a start." Elijah ran a hand through his hair. "It's not enough. Not yet. But it's something," Mary insisted. "They're noticing, and you're still standing. That's more than they want to admit." Elijah took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. But Mary's words gave him a sense of renewed purpose. If he could just hold on a little longer, maybe things could change. Margaret had been receiving cold glances and whispers wherever she went. It was subtle at first. Someone would turn their head when she passed, or a conversation would stop when she entered a room. But soon, the whispers grew louder. The backlash was inevitable. That afternoon, Margaret was walking down the street when she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the local diner. She slowed her pace, curious, and heard a voice rise above the murmurs. "Did you hear about Miss Fletcher?" the voice asked. "She's been spending all her time with that Elijah. People are saying she's gone off the rails. She's supporting him, of all people." Margaret's stomach twisted. She didn't want to face them, but she couldn't avoid it any longer. She lifted her chin and walked past the group, ignoring their stares and hushed words. As she continued down the street, a voice called out to her from behind. "You better watch your step, Margaret. You don't want to be seen with him. Folks around here don't forget things like that." Margaret turned slowly to face the woman, a neighbor she had known for years. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "If standing by what's right means losing friends, then I've already made my choice," she said quietly. "And I'll keep making it, no matter the cost." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more as Margaret turned and walked away. The path ahead was uncertain, but Margaret knew she could no longer turn back. Margaret's resolve solidified with each passing day. She no longer flinched when the townsfolk gave her cold looks, or when her social circle seemed to shrink. She had chosen her side, and she was not going to back down. But she knew that things were escalating, and the time for quiet resistance was over. She began to talk to other women in the town, some of them sympathetic, others on the fence. Slowly, she began to gather a small group of people who were willing to take a stand, to support Elijah openly. One evening, Margaret called a meeting at her home. The room was small, but filled with determination. Gladys, who had been the silent observer for so long, spoke up. "We can't keep hiding," Gladys said, her voice firm. "We need to stand with Elijah, not just behind closed doors. It's time to make a real statement." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. "We'll have to be careful. The town is already on edge. But it's time we show them we're not afraid." The small group agreed, and plans began to take shape for a protest, a peaceful demonstration in the heart of the town square. It was risky, but Margaret was willing to take the chance. For Elijah, for change. The morning after the meeting, Elijah found a second note pinned to his door. This one was even more direct than the first. "Last warning. Close up, or we'll do it for you." Elijah stared at the note, his blood running cold. He knew it wasn't just idle threats. The town was growing desperate, and the violence was escalating. Margaret received a similar note later that day. Her heart raced as she read the words. But she wasn't going to be intimidated. This was her fight now, too. The protest began quietly, with just a few people showing up to stand with Elijah in the square. Word spread quickly, and within an hour, the crowd had grown. Elijah stood at the front of the small group, his heart pounding, but his posture proud. Margaret stood beside him, her face set in determined resolve. She could feel the tension building in the crowd. The town had never seen anything like this. A peaceful protest, but a loud message all the same. And then, the first stone flew. The protest had barely begun when the first stone flew. It came from the crowd of white onlookers gathered across the street, landing with a sharp crack just inches from Elijah's feet. The protesters froze. Margaret's heart stopped for a beat. "Elijah!" she gasped, grabbing his arm, pulling him away from the line of fire. The crowd tensed as more stones began to rain down. The atmosphere shifted from peaceful defiance to chaos in an instant. One of the stones struck a shop window, shattering the glass in a loud explosion. Screams rang out as people ducked, some scattering for cover while others shouted obscenities. "Stay calm," Margaret shouted over the din. "This isn't the way. Don't react." Elijah stood frozen for a moment, his body tense, ready to snap. He could feel the anger boiling in his chest, his fists clenched. But the sound of Margaret's voice broke through the rage, pulling him back from the brink. "Get back!" a voice shouted from the crowd of white men across the street. "This is our town. Go back to your own." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she looked around, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of the threat pressing down on them, but she refused to retreat. "We're not going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "This is Elijah's store, and he belongs here as much as anyone." The crowd simmered, divided between those who supported the protest and those who wanted it to end in violence. The tension was palpable, and Margaret could feel the shifting momentum. Elijah turned to face her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "Let's keep going," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination. But just as he spoke, the sheriff's car rolled into the square, its siren blaring. The sheriff, a tall man with a hard face, stepped out, scanning the scene. "This is an unlawful gathering," he announced gruffly. "Everyone needs to disperse now." The sheriff's presence brought a temporary silence to the square. People began to pull back, their movements hesitant as they awaited his next command. Elijah stood at the front of the protest, his hands at his sides, his posture still defiant. Margaret moved beside him, her breath shallow. The sheriff eyed the crowd, then turned his gaze toward Elijah. His eyes narrowed, and he spat on the ground. "This you're doing, Elijah?" the sheriff asked, his voice low and menacing. "It's not about me," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "It's about standing up for what's right." The sheriff scoffed. "What's right? This town doesn't care about your rights. You're just stirring up trouble where there's no need for it." Margaret stepped forward, her heart racing but her voice unwavering. "You can't silence people just because they speak the truth. Elijah deserves the same rights as anyone else in this town." The sheriff's gaze turned to Margaret, his eyes hard. "You do well to stay out of this, Miss Fletcher. You don't want to get caught in the middle of this mess." She didn't flinch. "It's already too late for that. This is bigger than you think." A tense silence filled the air as the sheriff looked between Margaret and Elijah, weighing his options. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. "You've got 10 minutes to clear out, or I'll start making arrests," he said gruffly, before turning and heading back to his car. The crowd shifted uneasily, many of them looking to Elijah and Margaret for direction. "Everyone stay calm," Elijah said, his voice carrying. "We'll leave, but we're not backing down." The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of the protesters giving the sheriff a final, defiant look as they walked away. Elijah and Margaret remained standing, watching the scene unfold around them. The protest was over, for now. As the crowd cleared, the town square returned to its uneasy calm. Elijah and Margaret walked side by side down the street, the echo of their footsteps the only sound in the silence. Elijah's eyes were distant, his face tense. "They think they can scare us away," he muttered. "But it's just going to get worse from here, isn't it?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I know we can't stop now. If we do, it's over. We have to show them that we're not afraid. They reached the small alley beside Elijah's store, the place where he often took a moment to collect himself. He leaned against the brick wall, taking a deep breath. Margaret stood by his side, trying to steady her own racing heart. "We'll get through this," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty that gripped her chest. Elijah looked at her, his expression softening. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Margaret. You're risking everything. And for what?" "For what's right," she answered quietly. "Because if I don't, who will?" That evening, as Margaret sat by her window, staring out at the quiet streets, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Gladys standing on the porch, her face grave. "You've got to be careful, Miss Margaret," Gladys said in a low voice, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. "The men who did this, those who threw stones, well, they're not going to stop. They're already talking about doing worse." Margaret's stomach twisted. "What do you mean by worse?" "They're going to start intimidating anyone who stands with Elijah. They'll go after you next. They've made that clear. They might try something more dangerous next time." Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the door frame. "What should I do?" Gladys hesitated, her face tight with worry. "You need to be careful. They won't stop unless someone stops them." Margaret nodded slowly, her mind racing with the weight of the warning. "Thank you, Gladys. I'll be careful." The following morning, just as Margaret was preparing breakfast, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Edward Grant, the supplier from whom she had arranged the deliveries to Elijah's store. He looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder as if he feared being seen. "Miss Fletcher," he said in a low voice, "I wanted to speak with you privately. I've heard about the protest, about what's happening in town." Margaret gestured for him to come inside. "What's going on, Edward?" Edward stepped into the parlor, looking around cautiously. He took a seat, his expression worried. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to pull the deliveries. The situation's too volatile right now. The risks are too great, for me and for Elijah. I've already heard talk that they might try to run him out of business. I can't afford to be caught up in this mess." Margaret's heart sank. "You can't be serious. Elijah needs those supplies." I know, Edward replied, his voice apologetic. "But if I keep delivering, it's going to make me a target. And I have my own family to think about." Margaret sat down heavily, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. "I understand your position. But this is wrong, Edward. Elijah has every right to be here, and his store has a right to survive." "I'm not saying he doesn't," Edward said, his face pained. "But right now, it's not just about right and wrong. It's about survival." Later that evening, Elijah sat in his shop, staring at the dwindling stock on his shelves. Mary had gone home for the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The threat of violence hung in the air like a storm cloud. He paced back and forth, his mind racing. Was it time to give up? Should he pack up and leave before it got any worse? The idea of abandoning everything his father had built weighed heavily on him. Just then, Margaret arrived, her face grim but determined. She could tell from his posture that something was wrong. "Elijah?" she asked softly, walking toward him. He looked up at her, his face a mixture of frustration and resolve. "The supplier's pulling out. No more deliveries. It's over." Margaret's heart dropped. She stepped forward, taking his hand in hers. "You can't give up. You've already come so far." "I don't know how much further I can go," he admitted, his voice low. "The threats are real. And if I stay, I risk losing everything. Not just the store, but my life." "You're not alone in this," Margaret said quietly. "I'm here. We're all here. And we're not going to let them win." The conversation was silent but heavy as Margaret and Elijah stood in the dim light of the store. The road ahead was uncertain, and both knew it was only going to get harder. But in the midst of the growing storm, they made a silent promise. They wouldn't give up. "I'll do what I can to find another supplier," Margaret said, determination in her voice. "It won't be easy, but we'll figure it out." "I don't know how," Elijah said, the doubt evident in his voice. "We'll figure it out," Margaret repeated, more firmly this time. "Together." As night fell, The streets of Havenwood grew quiet. The last remnants of the protest were behind them, but Margaret knew it wasn't over. The storm was coming. But in the stillness of the evening, with Elijah by her side and the knowledge that they had made their stand, Margaret felt something stir within her. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. The next move was theirs. The morning after their discussion, Elijah and Margaret gathered at the small table in the back of the store, discussing their next move. They had a glimmer of hope, a potential new supplier who might be willing to deliver goods. The quiet buzz of the shop seemed to offer a temporary respite from the tension that had been mounting in the town. But just as they were beginning to feel a little more optimistic, the door to the store swung open, and in walked a group of well-dressed men. The group of white men was older, and they moved with an air of authority, like a quiet storm. Among them was the town's mayor, a stout, imposing man named Samuel Garrett, who had lived in Havenwood for decades. He was flanked by two of the wealthiest men in town, Thomas Aldridge, who owned the largest mill, and Reverend James Barker, the local preacher. Elijah immediately tensed, his body going rigid as he saw the group enter. Margaret, too, felt a cold wave of anxiety pass through her. This wasn't a casual visit. "Morning, Elijah," Mayor Garrett said in a low, gravelly voice. "Mind if we have a word?" Elijah glanced at Margaret before nodding. "What's this about?" "It's about your store," Thomas Aldridge said, his voice sharp and dismissive. "We've been hearing a lot of things about your business practices, about how you've been getting special treatment around here." Margaret stepped forward, standing protectively beside Elijah. "What's the problem, Mr. Aldridge?" "Elijah's doing nothing wrong." The mayor held up a hand, silencing the room. "This town has its way of doing things, Miss Fletcher, and that way doesn't involve people like Elijah trying to change it. We believe this situation needs to be resolved peacefully." Elijah's face hardened. "And what do you mean by that?" Reverend Barker spoke next, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of menace. "We think it's in everyone's best interest if you pack up and leave, Elijah. You've made your point, but this store, it's causing too much trouble. It's making people uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "This is his store. He's been here for years. The only thing causing discomfort is the way people are treating him." Mayor Garrett's eyes narrowed. "This is not up for debate. We've spoken to a number of influential members of this town, and they all agree. The situation can't go on." Elijah stood straighter, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm not leaving." The mayor sighed heavily, as though he had been expecting this response. "Then you leave us no choice. We'll make sure that your business can operate here. No more supplies. No more customers. No one will support you." "And what if I stay?" Elijah asked quietly. The mayor gave him a cold smile. "Then you'll find out just how far we're willing to go." With a final, threatening look, the men turned and exited the store, leaving Elijah and Margaret standing in stunned silence. The visit from the town's elders left a mark on both Elijah and Margaret. Margaret was unsettled, but her determination to stand by Elijah remained firm. Elijah, however, was feeling the pressure mounting. The threat had been made clear. He had no place in the town anymore. That afternoon, Margaret went to visit her friend, Gladys, at her home. Gladys had been one of the few women who hadn't turned her back on Margaret, and Margaret was in desperate need of advice and comfort. "Gladys," Margaret said, sitting down beside her, "they've made it clear they're not going to stop. Elijah's being cornered. The mayor, Aldridge, and the Reverend, they're putting so much pressure on him." Gladys wrung her hands nervously. "I've heard things too. Some of the people I know are saying that Elijah's store is going to cause trouble for all of us. It's not just the men in the square. They're stirring up fear in the community. People are starting to pull away from him. And Margaret, they're not just threatening him anymore. It's you too. They're saying you're a traitor to your own kind." Margaret felt a sickening knot in her stomach. "What are we supposed to do, Gladys? They're threatening to run him out of business. They'll cut off his supplies, make sure no one buys from him. How long can he last like that?" Gladys shook her head, her face lined with worry. "I don't know. I'm scared, Margaret. I really am." Margaret sighed. her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "I can't let this stand, Gladys. Elijah can't do this alone. I won't let them win." Gladys looked at her, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Maybe you should take the protest further. The town needs to see that Elijah isn't just standing alone, that he has people behind him. Real people." Margaret nodded slowly, her mind working through the possibilities. "You're right. It's time to make this bigger. I'll talk to the others." That evening, Margaret gathered the group of women who had supported her from the beginning: Gladys, Mary, and a few others who had quietly voiced their agreement. This time, the conversation was different. The stakes had escalated, and they knew the danger they were about to face. "We can't just sit here and let them push Elijah out of town," Margaret said, her voice strong. "We have to fight back." "I agree," Gladys said, her hands trembling as she spoke. "But how? The sheriff's already threatened us. The mayor is in on this. And now they've turned the whole town against him." "There are more of us than there are of them," Margaret said with quiet determination. "We have to show them that we're not afraid. We need to organize a bigger protest, one that the whole town can see. If we make it loud enough, we might even draw attention from outside Havenwood." "But it's risky," Mary said, shaking her head. "If we do this, they'll retaliate. They'll come after us." "I know," Margaret said, her voice low, "but sometimes you have to take risks for what's right. Elijah's store is just the beginning. If we let them drive him out now, who's next?" The group fell silent, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. But in their eyes, Margaret saw the same spark of defiance that had burned in her heart since the beginning. "We're doing this," she said firmly. "It's time to stand up to them." The days that followed were filled with quiet organizing. Margaret and the others made plans, speaking to anyone who would listen. Slowly, but surely, the protest grew. People from the town's black community, as well as a few sympathetic white townsfolk, began to rally around Elijah. Word spread, and soon enough, it became clear that there was a much larger group willing to stand up to the town's power structure. The protest was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Elijah and Margaret met early that day, going over their plans for the rally. "I'm scared, Margaret," Elijah said, his voice tight with anxiety. "What if it gets worse? What if it gets violent?" "We can't think like that," she replied firmly. "We're doing this for you. For everyone who's ever been treated like this. They'll see we won't back down." The morning of the protest, the streets were quieter than usual. The air was thick with anticipation, and Margaret could feel the eyes of the town on her. As she made her way to Elijah's store, she saw the small crowd starting to gather, murmurs of conversation filling the air. Elijah stood at the front, his posture proud but his expression uneasy. Margaret joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be all right," she whispered, her eyes steady on him. Together, they stepped into the town square, where more and more people had begun to assemble. As they reached the center, a few familiar faces joined in, and then others. Soon, the crowd had grown significantly. The protest was no longer just about Elijah. It was about standing up for justice against the oppression of a system that sought to silence voices like theirs. And yet, the tension was palpable. Margaret could feel the weight of the town's watchful eyes upon them. As the crowd grew, so did the hostility from the other side. Men and women who had been quietly whispering their disapproval began to gather in the square, shouting insults and curses. Some of them had brought signs, crude words scrawled across them. "Go back to where you belong," one sign read. "No room for your kind," another said. The tension quickly escalated into shouting. Elijah stood at the front of the crowd, his hands clenched at his sides, while Margaret stayed close by his side. The opposing crowd began to inch forward, and the sheriff arrived, his presence immediately calming the angry men. But not the protesters. "Enough!" the sheriff shouted, his voice booming. "This protest is over." But Elijah didn't back down. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his voice carrying. The sheriff's hand went to his baton, but before he could make a move, a voice called out from behind Elijah, "Let them stand." The crowd parted to reveal an unexpected ally, Gladys. The sheriff hesitated, and for a moment, It seemed as if the protest might turn violent. But then, one by one, more people stepped forward, joining the protest. White, black, men, and women, all standing in solidarity with Elijah. The tide was shifting. Havenwood was no longer a town of quiet complacency. The balance of power was shifting too. The day ended in chaos and victory. While no one was injured, the impact of the protest rippled through the town. The sheriff had stood down. The crowd had been dispersed, but the message had been made clear. Havenwood wasn't going to stay silent any longer. But the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The days following the protest were tense. The streets of Havenwood were quieter than usual, with an air of uncertainty hanging over the town. Margaret could feel the weight of the past week pressing on her. Though their stand had been heard, it wasn't a victory yet. The forces arrayed against them weren't backing down. At Elijah's store, business had slowed. The threat of violence still loomed, and the town's resistance wasn't easily swayed. But Elijah was more resolute than ever. They hadn't won yet, but they had made a point. Margaret arrived at the store early in the morning. Elijah was already behind the counter, sorting through what little stock remained. The absence of deliveries was a silent but constant reminder of the struggle they faced. "How are you holding up?" Margaret asked as she walked in. "I'm all right," Elijah replied, though his tone was tired. "But I won't pretend it's easy. The town's divided more than ever now." Margaret placed a hand on the counter, her fingers tapping lightly. "That's true. But change never comes easily. And I can feel something shifting. People are starting to ask questions." Elijah met her gaze, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You really think so?" "I do. But we can't stop now. This isn't just about your store anymore. It's about all of us." Later that afternoon, as Elijah worked in the back room, a sharp knock echoed through the store. Margaret glanced up, instinctively feeling the tension in the air before the door even opened. It was the sheriff. Sheriff Watkins entered, his uniform stiff and his face grim. He took off his hat and placed it on the counter, his eyes darting around the store before focusing on Margaret. "You here to intimidate us too, Sheriff?" Margaret asked, crossing her arms. The sheriff didn't flinch, but his voice was lower than usual. "Listen, Miss Fletcher. I'm not here for trouble. I'm just doing my job. You're stirring up a lot of noise in this town. People are scared. It's not safe, and you know it." Margaret's gaze hardened. "You think we're scared? Because we're not. If you think your threats are going to make us back down, you're wrong." "I didn't come here to argue," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "But I came to warn you. The next time you push this issue, the town's going to get ugly. And it won't just be Elijah that's affected. It'll be all of you." Margaret stood tall, refusing to back down. "We've heard all of this before, Sheriff. You can't scare us into silence. Not anymore." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "I hope you know what you're doing, because this is going to get worse before it gets better." As the week went on, the town began to show clear signs of division. Margaret and Elijah saw it in the looks people gave them on the street, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, and the way their presence seemed to unsettle both sides of the community. But there were others too. There were whispers of support. Gladys stopped by the store that afternoon with a determined look on her face. "We've got more people than you think. It's not just black folk either. There are some who are beginning to question how long this town can keep going on like this." Elijah looked at her, hesitant but hopeful. "You really think so?" Gladys nodded. "I do. It's slow, but it's growing. We just need to keep pushing. People are starting to see the truth, even if they're scared to admit it." Margaret gave a small, relieved smile. "We'll keep pushing, but we need to act fast. If we wait too long, it'll be too late." Gladys looked over her shoulder, as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping, then leaned in. "There's talk. They're planning something. They're planning to burn the store down. I don't know who's behind it, but they'll make sure it's gone before the week is out." The news hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. "What do? "We stay ahead of them," Margaret said quickly. "We tell as many people as we can. We make sure that if they try, they'll be stopped before they can do any real damage." That night, Margaret stayed up late, going over her plans. The fire was looming, and she knew it wasn't just about protecting the store. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could erase everything Elijah had built. She spent hours walking through the streets of Havenwood, speaking to anyone who would listen. She approached the sympathetic townsfolk, some of whom had begun to silently support the protest, others who feared repercussions but were willing to speak quietly in their own homes. Each conversation reinforced her belief that, even in the face of hatred, change was possible. But then, as she neared the end of her route, she was stopped by someone she wasn't expecting, Reverend James Barker. He was standing alone in the shadows near the edge of town, his face etched with something between anger and regret. "Margaret," he called softly, stepping forward. "I've been listening, and I've been praying, and I'm not sure what I've been doing. This town has been living with hatred for so long, and I thought I was doing right by it. But I see now. I see how wrong I've been." Margaret blinked, unsure of how to respond. "You see it now?" "I see it now," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's wrong. And I can't pretend any longer. I've been a part of the problem." Margaret's heart raced. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Reverend Barker took a deep breath. "I'm going to speak out. In church on Sunday. I can't keep this to myself. I have to tell the people what's really been happening." The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Margaret arrived at Elijah's store early. Her nerves were frayed, but she had a plan. She'd managed to rally a group of people, mostly women and a few brave men, who had pledged to stay close to the store. They would keep watch through the night, just in case the threat of fire became real. Elijah arrived soon after, his face tight with worry. "Have you heard anything? Are they coming tonight?" "I don't know," Margaret said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But we have to be ready. I'm not letting them burn this place down. Not without a fight." Just as she spoke, the first signs of smoke began to rise in the distance. It was faint at first, just a wisp on the morning air. But soon it thickened into a dark, choking plume, rising from the center of town. "It's happening," Elijah said, his voice tight. Margaret looked at him, her heart racing. "We have to stop them. Now." The crowd began to gather quickly, some running toward the source of the smoke, others spilling out of their homes, alarmed by the sight. Elijah and Margaret pushed their way through the streets, heading toward the fire. They could see the flames now, leaping up into the sky, the glow bright in the early morning light. But it wasn't just the fire. It was the people. A group of protesters, led by none other than Reverend Barker, had already gathered in front of the building where the fire was being set. They stood in defiance, shouting down the group of white men who had been responsible for the fire. "Stop this," Reverend Barker shouted, his voice ringing through the air. "This violence ends now. This town can't keep living like this." The men hesitated, the fire in their hands flickering uncertainly. The crowd of protesters stood strong in front of them, holding the line. Margaret and Elijah joined the front of the protest. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he stood tall, his back straight, as the townsfolk, black and white, stood beside him. "Stop it," Elijah called out, his voice filled with quiet rage. "This store is not just mine. It's for all of us." The standoff was tense. The men who had set the fire were now surrounded, their resolve cracking under the pressure. One by one, they dropped their matches and firebrands, realizing that they were outnumbered. "Go home," Margaret said firmly, her voice cutting through the air. "Go home and think about what you've done." And they did. The crowd began to disperse, the threat of violence having passed for the moment. Elijah turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with relief. "We did it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "For now," Margaret replied, her gaze fixed on the smoldering remains of what could have been a tragedy. "But it's not over yet." As the fire was put out and the crowd slowly began to fade, Elijah and Margaret stood in the center of the street, looking at each other. They had faced the worst of what the town had to offer, but they had stood their ground. "It's just the beginning," Elijah said softly. Margaret nodded. "It is. But change is coming, and there's no turning back now." In the days following the standoff, Havenwood felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. The fire had been extinguished, But the damage to the town's fragile peace had already been done. People were choosing sides now more than ever. Margaret could feel the tension in the air as she walked through the streets. Some faces greeted her with silent approval, while others turned away in disdain. At Elijah's store, business had picked up a little, but not enough to make a real difference. It wasn't just about the store anymore. It was about what Elijah represented. People who once walked past without a second thought now avoided looking his way, while others came to him for support, even if it meant defying the social order. Margaret sat with Elijah at the small table in the back of the store, the weight of the situation sinking in. "We've made progress," Margaret said, "but we've also made ourselves targets. The town is more divided now than it was before. People don't know who to trust anymore." Elijah exhaled deeply, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. They've got everyone riled up. We're pushing too far, and I'm afraid of what happens next." Margaret placed a hand over his. "We're doing the right thing, Elijah. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure what the next step would be. The power of the town's resistance had grown stronger, and she could feel the storm building again. Late one evening, as the sun set and the streets emptied, Margaret received an unexpected visitor at the store. It was Gladys, though this time, her expression was grave. "Margaret," Gladys said, glancing nervously around before stepping inside. "We need to talk." "About what?" Margaret asked, leading her into the back room. Gladys hesitated, her eyes darting from side to side. "There's been a meeting. The town's elders, Garrett, Aldrich, Barker, they're planning something. They've put out a call for all the people who supported your protest to be dealt with. They're organizing a group to force Elijah out of the store, and they'll stop at nothing to do it." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, stop at nothing? What's their plan?" "I don't know all the details," Gladys replied, her voice trembling, "but there's talk of bringing in outside help. Mercenaries. People who will do what needs to be done to intimidate you and anyone who's with you. They're serious this time." Margaret stood up, her mind racing. "We can't let that happen. We fought too hard to back down now." Gladys nodded. "I'm with you. I just thought you should know what's coming." That night, Margaret and Elijah huddled together with their most trusted supporters, Gladys, Reverend Barker, and a few others who had quietly been organizing behind the scenes. They knew the town was on the edge of something dangerous, and they had to be ready. "This is bigger than just protecting the store now," Reverend Barker said, his voice filled with the weight of the moment. "We're standing up to a system that's tried to keep people like Elijah out of this town for years. We can't let them win." "But we need a plan," Margaret replied, her mind spinning. "We can't just wait around for them to strike. We need to organize. We need the people to rally behind us. If we can get enough support, we might be able to stop them before they act." Elijah sat silently, his hands clenched. "But what if it gets violent? What if it's too much for us to handle?" "We don't know what they're capable of," Gladys said quietly, "but we do know one thing. We're not backing down. If we don't fight now, they'll erase everything we've worked for." The group exchanged tense glances. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. It wasn't just about Elijah's store anymore. It was about standing up for everything they believed in. The next morning, Havenwood was quieter than usual. But beneath the calm, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Word had spread that something was coming, and people were preparing for it. Margaret had organized a group of supporters to gather at the town square, hoping that a visible show of unity would send a message to those trying to tear them down. Elijah was standing outside the store, watching as a small group of people began to assemble. It wasn't a large crowd, but it was enough to make a statement. The tension grew thick as the town's power brokers began to arrive, the same men who had tried to silence them before. Mayor Garrett, Thomas Aldridge, and Sheriff Watkins were all present, flanked by their loyalists. "Margaret," Gladys whispered, "they're here." Margaret turned, meeting Elijah's gaze. "We're ready. Stay close to me." As Garrett approached, he gave Margaret a cold smile. "So, this is your big stand, huh?" "We're not backing down, Garrett," Margaret said, her voice steady. "You can threaten us all you want, but we're not going anywhere." Aldridge snorted. his arms crossed over his chest. "This is bigger than your little store, Miss Fletcher. It's about the future of this town. And people like you, people like him," he pointed at Elijah, "are not part of it." Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady despite the danger he knew was coming. "I've been part of this town longer than any of you. I'm not leaving. And neither is anyone else who believes in justice." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand resting on his baton. "This is your last warning. Leave now, or we'll make you leave." Margaret's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. "We're staying. If you want to arrest us, go ahead. But know this, we're not the ones who will be remembered as the criminals in this town." The standoff was tense. On one side, Margaret, Elijah, and their supporters stood firm. On the other side, the town's power brokers, backed by the sheriff and a few of their loyalists, stood ready to force them out. The first stone was thrown by one of the men in the opposing crowd. It hit the ground between them with a loud crack, but no one moved. Then another voice rang out from the crowd, a familiar voice. "It's time to stand up to this." Reverend Barker stepped forward, his face resolute. "These people are not our enemies. We are all part of this community, and we will not be silenced." His words seemed to catch the crowd off guard. The sheriff and the other men looked to each other, uncertain. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising on both sides. The power of Reverend Barker's words had begun to chip away at the walls that had kept the town divided. But it wasn't enough. The tension snapped when one of the men, out of frustration, rushed forward with a club, swinging it wildly at Elijah. The crowd surged forward. Margaret stepped in front of Elijah, pushing him behind her as the violence erupted. She fought back, her own adrenaline taking over as she defended the man she cared for. In the chaos, the town square became a battleground. But it wasn't just about physical violence. It was about ideologies clashing in the streets. People had to decide. Would they stand with the oppressive system, or would they choose to stand for justice? As the struggle intensified, something unexpected happened. One by one, people from both sides began to intervene. Not with violence, but with words. "Enough!" someone shouted. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, someone Margaret had never seen before. She was older, with a strong but tired face. "I've been living in this town for over 50 years, and I'm tired of watching us destroy each other. This isn't what Havenwood was meant to be." Slowly, others began to speak up. One by one, more and more people from both sides began to step forward, urging an end to the violence. Margaret looked at Elijah, her heart swelling with hope. "We can do this," she whispered. And then, for the first time in a long while, it seemed like the town was starting to listen. By the time the dust settled, the confrontation had ended. The town square was filled with broken glass and scattered debris. But there was something else too, a quiet sense of resolve. The protest hadn't ended in defeat. It had forced the town to confront the reality of its divisions. Elijah stood with Margaret, side by side. The fight wasn't over yet, but they had taken a huge step forward. They had shown the town what it meant to fight for justice, to stand against the powers that had kept people like Elijah silent for so long. "We'll keep fighting," Elijah said softly. Margaret smiled, her voice firm. Together. The fight for Elijah's store, for justice, wasn't over. But for the first time, there was hope. The people of Havenwood had been forced to confront their own hatred, and while not everyone would change, there was a shift. The protest had given voice to those who had been silent for far too long. Margaret, Elijah, and their supporters knew they had to keep pushing forward. They had taken the first step toward a new future, and that future, for the first time, didn't seem as impossible as it once had.